Commission's Deputy Chief Counsel and our current interim Chief Counsel. I've been with the Commission now for 10 years, actually 10 years this July. As part of my role with the Commission, I've been litigating cases involving discrimination the entire time that I've been here. I've also been supervising a team of prosecutors who also litigate cases involving discrimination. As a mother of 4, I truly understand what it means to educate and to watch your child experience discrimination or experience bullying and harassment in schools. And so this is certainly an issue that is dear to me. The children in Pennsylvania are not being educated free of discrimination. We need to do better. And today's, I hope, a good step in that direction. So thank you.
Thank you. For our second panelist, we have Attorney Paige Jokey. Paige, are you with us?
No?
I can see that she's speaking, but we can't hear her. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Apologies for the tech on my end. I am so excited to be with you all today. My name is Paige Jokey, and I'm a staff attorney at the Education Law Center in Pennsylvania, which is a nonprofit legal advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring access to quality public education for all of Pennsylvania's children. We have 3 key priorities: ensuring equal access, adequate and equitable school funding, and dismantling pathways to confinement. At ELC, I have the pleasure of leading our Black Girls Education Justice Initiative, which is our specific work to ensure that Black girls aren't being subject to anti-Black racism, sexism, and other types of intersectional discrimination in our schools, because we know that to have truly high quality and affirming education, our students need and deserve every opportunity to thrive. And I'm so excited to get into that with you all today about what to do when things go sideways and when our young people are being deprived of their fundamental right to education. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. And so we're going to have an in-depth discussion. And at the end, preferably at the last 5 or 10 minutes, that's when we will be accepting questions from the audience. But I kind of want to just dive right into the questions. Morgan, if you could you please define what bullying and harassment is?
Sure. I'd like to start with a story, if I could. My children are biracial. We live in a not very diverse community. And when my daughter was in high school, her class was reading the book Tom Sawyer. Is everybody familiar with Tom Sawyer? And I was particularly excited and moved that my daughter's teacher reached out to her when they first started this book to talk to her about how she would feel as the only student of color in the classroom as this book was going to be read. The teacher had plans to kind of read this book out loud and have the students help read this book out loud. And my daughter proceeded to tell the teacher that she would feel uncomfortable with some of the words that are used in this book, right? There are some derogatory terms that are used in the book for African Americans. Everybody know which term I'm referring to? Okay. So my daughter's teacher approached her, asked her how she felt. She said she would be uncomfortable about reading that text out loud in the current form. She felt really heard by the teacher. We thought it was a great approach to have reached out to her. She went into class the next day and they proceeded to read the book. However, they read the book using all of the terms that were contained in the book. The teacher decided that she wanted to kind of keep that book true to form. And so my daughter sat in class while her classmates used these words. She felt uncomfortable. She was humiliated. It was a terrible experience. It was a terrible way to start what was a pretty new school for her. And obviously that experience left her pretty traumatized. Traumatized in the classroom, traumatized for the rest of the semester with this teacher. The students in the class, I believe, felt uncomfortable with what they were doing. Throughout the time that she spent with this teacher, that forever kind of changed the relationship that she had. And so when I think about bullying and harassment, I think it's more important to think about it holistically. There are the traditional types of bullying and harassment that can occur in the educational context. You know, we have kids who are referred to by slurs, including students with disabilities. We have students that are physically attacked because of who they are or what they look like. But you also have environments that can, the way that they are set up and the way that they progress through the school day can constitute this unlawful harassment. In order for bullying and harassment to be unlawful, it kind of has to hit a few prerequisites. First, bullying and harassment has to be taken against the student or in the environment based on what we call a protected class. So in Pennsylvania, that's things like race, color, national origin, ethnicity, disability being one of them. And they need to be based, or the comments or the actions that the student is subject to needs to be based on that protected class. The conduct also needs to be sufficiently severe or pervasive. Now, what I described for my daughter is kind of an example of what could start to form an environment that is pervasive with discrimination. It's important to remember that the discrimination, the harassment and bullying can be perpetrated by any number of individuals. It could be teachers, it could be students, it could be administrators, it could be third parties that enter into the school district. And there are also certain other requirements that need to be met in order to hold a school accountable for that environment. They need to have some sort of control over what's going on. They need to have not taken appropriate action, things of that nature. The commission is going to be issuing some guidance relatively shortly, which I'm excited about. And that will lay out in much greater detail the requirements and how the commission will look at these types of cases. But in essence, bullying and harassment is class-based action taken against a student or observed by the student that is related to their class, and it has an impact of essentially denying that child education or equal education.
Thank you, Morgan, for really setting that groundwork for what the definition of bullying and harassment is. But I'm going to ask you, can you give us further examples of how you're seeing this? And I know that you're an attorney, so can you further explain what you see when it comes to these contexts of bullying and harassment?
Sure. So unfortunately, I think all schools, whether they're public schools or secondary education schools, vocational schools, struggle with bullying and harassment. We are still seeing things like outright, verbal insults. We're seeing physical attacks. But I think what I'd like to focus on that we are seeing are really policies and approaches that are not effective enough. Most of the policies, just like in the employment context, that we see are not adequately communicated to students. The districts are still taking reactive approaches, so responding to acts of discrimination as opposed to proactively taking these issues head on, dusting off those policies that are sitting on a shelf somewhere. And what has best been described to me as kind of a whack-a-mole approach, right? A student reports discrimination to a school district. The district deals with that particular situation, that particular student, that particular bad actor. That person hopefully gets the message and moves on, and another student pops up or another bad actor pops up with another form of discrimination. And so what we are seeing is really the lack of a holistic approach and a lack of a proactive approach to incidents of harassment and bullying. We've also seen the change in the way that bullying and harassment is able to be carried out in this day and age, where we have social media and ways for students to reach kids both in the classroom and outside of the classroom. We're seeing, more prevalent acts of harassment and bullying, and schools struggling with those issues on how to address those things.
Thank you, Morgan. Attorney Joki, can you tell us what is cyberbullying? Can you further explain the context of cyberbullying, please?
Absolutely. And is there a way that we could move to the next slide? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. 1 second.
Okay, perfect. All right, so one more, please. Thank you very much. And one more. All right, and thank you for the wonderful background. As was described, really the distinction between bullying and harassment is why a particular child or a person is being targeted for harm. Next slide, please. And if it's on the basis of a protected class, that would be harassment. One more slide, please. One more slide, please. There should be one more on cyberbullying. All right, well, I will speak then and be sure that we have the updated slide deck shared with everybody. But the important thing to know is that bullying does include acts that are electronic. So when we think about what cyberbullying means, that does mean that if somebody is making harmful comments over the internet, on social media, through DMs, since some of us are on Zoom today, so the chat function is one place, unfortunately, that we do see young people being subject to offensive and harmful comments that do rise to the level of being bullying. What is really important to know is that our anti-bullying state law is specific that school entities, so local education agencies, cannot be prohibited from defining bullying in such a way that encompasses behaviors outside of the school setting if those actions meet the criteria of what is set forth under the definition of bullying in state law. So that would be if it's substantially interfering with a student's education, creating a threatening environment, or substantially disrupting the orderly operation of a school. So the important thing to know is that just because it's happening on the internet and maybe outside of the schoolhouse doors doesn't mean that it isn't actionable. What's also important to remember is that Pennsylvania also has a law against cyber harassment, and that is considered to be a criminal offense. So sometimes young people who are still learning what to say and what to do and what not to say and do, there can be collateral consequences that can follow young people for many years to come. So what's important is that if you are engaging in cyber harassment over the internet, which is considered to be seriously disparaging statements or opinions about child's physical characteristics, sexuality, sexual activity, or mental or physical health or condition, or threats to inflict harm, that can be something that is legally actionable. And while our law does provide the instruction to first consider diversionary programs, young people's behavior can have repercussions outside of the school disciplinary context. So it's really important that we are addressing conditions that make children unsafe in schools, unprotected in schools, and really ensure that students' rights are safeguarded. What Morgan was sharing at the beginning with the story about her daughter, I felt in my soul. That was my experience. I can put myself back in that seat, feeling those feelings. And I think one thing that's very important for us all to remember is that young people are perceiving adults' actions. And so if adults aren't taking action and aren't modeling appropriate, inclusive, affirming behavior, we are going to create school environments that aren't responsive to young people's needs, and it can actually be places of harm. We know that schools have the power to be protective factors, to connect young people to resources, to be places where they're learning, where they feel safe and supported and have access to adults who provide vital services like special education supports, language access, nursing supports, nutrition programs. And when we have environments where bullying and harassment is thriving, which I agree is in all of our schools, really the response does need to be holistic, because witnessing, experiencing, and being in climates that are riddled with bullying and harassment creates harm for all members of our school community. And I will pause there.
Thank you so much. And Attorney Joki, if you could you further explain how bullying and harassment really impact the students' lives from your perspective?
Oh goodness, yes. So all facets of students' education are impacted and degraded when bullying and harassment is happening. If you're curious about learning more about this, through Education Law Center's Black Girls Education Justice Initiative, we released a report last May called We Need Supportive Spaces That Celebrate Us. Black Girls Speak Out About Public Schools. And that was a report that we did that uplifts the recommendations made by student experts about what they need to thrive in school. It ranges from everything from having culturally responsive curriculum to appropriate dress and grooming codes to teachers and mental health professionals that look like the students they're serving, to responsive curriculum, to removing police from schools. And what was common, no matter how students were learning, in person, virtually, in neighborhood schools, in cyber programs, in charter schools, in programs contained in residential placements or in the juvenile legal system, harassment was something that every single one of the young people that we spoke to experienced and saw others experiencing. And one thing I just wanted to mention is that, harassment is on the basis of protected class status, like race, like sex, like disability. And it doesn't mean that you can only be discriminated on one of those bases. What we see, especially through our Black Girls Education Justice Initiative, is the ways that anti-Black racism is really impacting other intersections that students might be experiencing oppression as a result of systemic violence like sexism and like ableism. And so when you think about what happens to students who are surviving bullying and harassment, they may not want to go to school. They might be fearful of attending school. They may not go at all, right? And then they may be subject to our compulsory school attendance law, which could result in them being removed from their home, them being fined, their parents or caregivers, the person in parental relation, actually being fined or jailed. And so the consequences can't be overstated. We know that education is something that is outcome determinative. It is a level of privilege. Your access to education impacts everything from how long you live, to your access to a living wage, to your ability to engage resources that are responsive in your community and your distance from hazards. And we know that when young people are being hurt in schools, including by bullying and harassment, they lose out on those opportunities that have intergenerational consequences. So while we have a really pernicious discourse in our society that bullying and harassment are normal, that they could be character building, that it's something that happens to everybody, those are misnomers that children can lose their lives over. It is that serious, and it needs to be treated as something that is preventable and something that nobody deserves to experience.
I absolutely agree. And you said something that kind of stuck out to me, how children will sometimes be a conduit of the community that they're in. That if they're in an environment where bullying, harassment, and discriminatory behavior is commonplace, then they're going to take that element with them and move into the community and spread that out. And so if you both could you talk about the importance of creating a safe environment for children so they can properly thrive in the community? We'll start with you, DCC Williams.
Sure. So I think it's important that schools create multiple places that are safe for students to report bullying and harassment, whether it's a guidance office with guidance counselors that are educated and trained to address bullying and harassment, who can connect parents to support services when things occur, or whether it's a principal or a vice principal that is in tune with what's going on with the school, or a teacher who's particularly responsive and can feel close to a student. It's really important that schools are providing multiple avenues for students to come forward and to talk about what they're experiencing, and to be on the lookout for changes in a child, and be able to reach out to them before things get too bad.
Thank you. Attorney Jokey, your turn.
Yes. Would you mind going back a couple of slides to the one that says supporting impacted students? I agree that it's really important for families and students to know that their schools are legally required to have a policy that describes conduct that is prohibited, both bullying and harassment, and that should be something that is widely circulated. When you think about how to support young people who are surviving these behaviors at school, as I mentioned before, it's really important to identify bullying and harassment as being illegal and wrong. And so for the adults in the room, we can mirror that for young people, to not downplay what they're experiencing and to really dig in to their experiences. DCC Williams is absolutely right. Something that I hear about a lot from caregivers who call ELC's helpline is that young people are experiencing drastic changes, right? Maybe they aren't eating. They are afraid to get out of bed. They're exhibiting a lot of anxiety when they're at school. Something else to look for is frequent calls home from the nurse. So are they having physical manifestations from symptoms? And pardon me for even having to share this, but it is something that we should all be mindful of does a child have unexplained injuries? Are they complaining of symptoms of things that a caregiver isn't aware of? When you think about how to actually make a report, it's important to know who to go to. And even if you don't know the names of the students or the teachers involved, you can still report and be as descriptive as possible when you make the report. So sometimes I speak to really young children, think preschool, kindergarten age, who may not know everybody's name, right? But I can ask questions like, are they in your classroom? Do you have recess with them? Do you know where they play on the playground? Do you happen to know what they were wearing? So you can be as detailed as possible in the report. When you are presenting evidence, and again, this is so difficult to talk about, but it's really important to know, because when you're making a report, you want to have all of the materials available to you, and that means cataloging the impact of bullying and harassment, including impacts that might be physical in nature. So as always, seek immediate treatment for all physical and mental injuries that a child may have survived, and ensure that those are documented. If you're not sure how to document information, contact an attorney of your choice about how to preserve things like text messages, emails, voice messages, so the student doesn't have to keep these things on their own accounts. I know, as somebody who has on occasion received correspondence that is inappropriate, that I do not want, that might be harassing, my first impulse in my body is to delete it, right? Make it go away. But in order to have a comprehensive report, it is really important that that is preserved and done in such a way that that young person doesn't have to engage with it, but that it's still preserved so it can be utilized later on. I'm not the most tech savvy, as you can tell from the Zoom already, but having another person to help can make a big difference. So for example, have somebody take a screenshot if something is coming over Snapchat, or having another phone to record. Something that I find really productive at a place where students and families and communities can really come together is around developing safety plans, which are documents that describe what supports a young person will receive at school and to help keep them safe. I like to think of a safety plan like a run of show. It should describe all of the events to keep that young person safe, where they will happen, who is responsible from the minute that young person comes to school to the time they leave the school building during the day, and including transportation if that is an area of concern. Something that's important to remember too is that when we're addressing bullying and harassment, sometimes the focus can be inundating the child that was harmed with additional resources, and that is important. We need to make sure that those impacts are remedied, but sometimes responses can be stigmatizing. So for example, in a hallway, rather than having an adult follow the child from point A to point B, consider adding more adults in the hallway overall, right? That addresses a wide scale climate concern. And if you still need a one-to-one, that's also all right. But just to make sure that that young person actually feels like they can engage the supports and don't feel singled out. Because the young people I work with sometimes will say, well, I'm afraid of reporting because I don't want people to think I'm telling. Or I was told I should keep this a secret, right? And when we have conversations in our communities that really downplay bullying and harassment and individualize a school-wide and community harm, we're doing young people a disservice and sending them a message that could prevent them or make them fearful of exercising their right to make a report, which they absolutely can and should be able to do. When young people seek support, it's important to make referrals to mental health supports and other supports that can be useful. I'm a huge proponent of therapy myself. I think it's something that everybody should have access to because we all deserve to nurture and care for our mental health and well-being. Sometimes complaints can take some time to resolve, so discuss some supports that could be used in the interim. And just as a reminder to everybody in this room, it is unlawful for schools or others to take action that's retaliatory for filing a complaint of bullying and harassment. And there are additional protections that apply, and you can file complaints on the basis of retaliation as well.
Thank you both. So for this next question, I really want you to really explore what your organization does to support students that are dealing with harassment and bullying. DCC Williams, we're going to start first with you. So what does the PHRC do to help these students?
Sure. So first and foremost, the commission is partnering with schools, either schools that ask for our assistance or schools that have been identified as having particular challenges. Our director of education is reaching out to those schools and offering some assistance. We can do things like training, anti-bullying and harassment training. We have a Spirit program, which pulls students and faculty together. So we are doing some proactive things. In addition, as Director Garcia mentioned in our previous presentation, the commission is here to take complaints of discrimination from parents on behalf of their students. And we investigate those cases. We look for instances where the law may be violated, and where we see violations of law, we'll take steps to correct those, either through voluntary conciliation with school districts, agreement to take certain steps to do things to remedy harassment and bullying, or through litigation. We will litigate violations of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, and we're here to do that as well. It's important to note that students and family members who feel as though they're being discriminated against who file with the commission don't need to obtain attorneys to do that. We have a neutral process that is friendly to all those that are involved. And if we do find violations of the law, the commission has prosecutors who prosecute these violations. And so this makes access to justice more accessible to individuals and their families.
Thank you, Morgan. Attorney Joki, how does your organization support these students?
Absolutely. So we run a legal helpline, and if you wouldn't mind going to the slide on ELCPA resources on addressing bullying and harassment, it's the one with all the fancy boxes. Thank you. Hyperlinked here are a comprehensive suite of resources around how to address bullying and harassment. We have a comprehensive guide for caregivers about students' rights and what to do. We have a checklist on how to actually file a request for investigation. We have a stepper for how to file a complaint with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and information on how to file complaints with the United States Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, and United States Department of Justice. And so these resources are free, they are online, you can access them on a phone as well. So if you're like me and like to do some, learning reading on train time, this might be one place for you to check out. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide as well. So here, thank you, are the two numbers to our legal helpline. We have one number for Philadelphia and one number for Pittsburgh. Call the office that's closest to where the child resides, and we are happy to do an intake. From there, what we do is we connect folks to an attorney and provide rights-based information, and we do take on a limited number of cases free of charge. Our helpline responds to over 1,000 calls each year, and I can tell you that a lot of those calls involve bullying and harassment. Unfortunately, this is something that is pervasive, and there are resources that are here to help. If you're interested in learning more specifically about how we try to create affirming schools for children in Pennsylvania, please check out our Black Girls Education Justice Initiative, as well as our initiative on honest education and inclusive schools, which addresses conditions that degrade learning experiences for children in Pennsylvania. I wanted to just take a quick minute, if you wouldn't mind, and sorry for the discombobulated order of slides, but there is a slide on safeguarding the rights of students with disabilities, and I would be remiss if I didn't provide a couple of tips to folks who may need to report on behalf of a young person who has disabilities. And as somebody who's disabled myself, I think it's really important for us to be thinking creatively about how we can ensure that students' rights are met and how we can protect them from discrimination on the basis of all of their protected classes, including that of disability. So if the student already has an IEP, an individualized education program, or Section 504 accommodations plan, request a meeting right away and send that in writing to the special education director or whatever that might be called at the school, as well as the school principal. It's important to think through, are there additional changes that need to be made to the student's IEP or 504 plan? Think from top to bottom. So are there academic skills that are needed? Are there behavioral skills? Are there supervision related needs in the building, during transition, during unstructured time? Unfortunately, that's where I see a lot of bullying and harassment happening. So think the hallway, think recess, think the minutes before class where there may not be an adult in the room, and also think about transportation. If a child has mental health needs or behavioral needs, or their learning is being impacted and they're being deprived of a free, appropriate public education, a FAPE, if you happen to be reading the literature and what the law defines that standard as, consider if evaluations or reevaluations, so testing, is needed to ensure that that child has all the supports and services that they need to access their education. And don't forget about safety planning. One thing that I found is really effective is actually getting schools to remind every single person working with that young person about the laws around bullying and harassment and around the school's policies. And one thing I've done to ensure accountability is to request that everybody signs off that they've received that training. That way there should be no question that the adults in the room know what to do. And if a young person has had their rights violated, there are remedies that you can seek, such as compensatory education or makeup services. I know that this is a lot of information, and if you have questions, please do reach out to us. We strive to get back to people in about 72 hours. So if you have questions on your mind, if you're thinking this might be my child or a young person who I'm supporting, think through if learning more information might be helpful.
Thank you both. And we just talked about what both organizations can do for these students. But now I'd like our panelists to ask or answer another question. What can the audience member do to help individuals who are dealing with harassment, help individuals who are dealing with bullying? What can we do as a people to help our children, our youth that are being harassed or bullied? So for this time, Attorney Joki, I'm gonna have you start off.
All right. I think there's something that we can all do, and I think being an affirming space for young people to come to is so, so important. So not normalizing this behavior, understanding the harm and really asking, like, how is this impacting you and what can I do? I think one thing working with young people, it's been a little while since I was in, high school, middle school, elementary school. And so maybe the things that I would feel supported and affirmed receiving aren't necessarily the same things that a client or a caregiver that I'm working with might want. And so the conversation I always have with young people and caregivers is like, what do you need at school? What would that look like to you? And I sort of go class by class with them, and they know, like, I need to have my seat moved. I need to have my classes changed. I need to be given additional support in these areas. And that's really where we start, right? The legal service profession is a serving profession, right? And I take my job very seriously to try to create transformative spaces for young people in schools. And that does include making sure that I'm aware of what young people need and always educating myself. So I do try to learn about what's happening in school now, because young people are the real-time experts about what's happening in our schools, and we should believe them, and we should do everything in our power to ensure that the types of experiences that many of us in this audience may have had aren't what the next generation of learners is experiencing.
Thank you. Morgan?
So I want to tap off a little bit of what Attorney Yoki said relating to creating affirming spaces for students, and I'm going to touch specifically on spaces for students with disabilities. Unfortunately, our younger kids are educated in environments that aren't really inclusive, where they're really kind of forced to identify their disabilities. So think about every student, every young student has a right to a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environments, right? Everyone in this room is familiar with the term special education, right? Why do we call it that? Why is it that we refer to students as students in special education? Why is it that we have classrooms that are dedicated to emotional support or learning support? Why is it that we are still continuing to see students educated in these very restrictive environments? And so when I think about what we can do for students, I think we can start protecting students by setting up environments for them so we're not putting targets on their back. We're not forcing them to identify their learning disabilities or their behavioral concerns or their emotional concerns just on the basis of where they get educated, right? And so as a parent, as a faculty member, you can advocate for students to have what is their right, to be educated with the rest of their peers. I know it's more convenient to put all of the children in one classroom who have behavioral issues so you can have an extra teacher in there, but that's not necessarily what's right for the particular student. Another thing that I want to touch upon that Attorney Yoki mentioned is we do really need to listen to our students. But when we listen to our students and we make promises to them, so we make safety plans or we put things in their individual education plan or their 504 plan, and we make these commitments to them, we have to follow through, right? All too often we see students who have these plans that aren't read by teachers, aren't implemented appropriately by teachers, or it's 3 months into the school year and we're still trying to figure out how to get that right? And so a student comes to their team vulnerable and they describe what it is that they need, and we listen, and then we don't put it into place. And so it's really, really important to follow through, and for us as a community, as parents, as faculty, to hold our districts accountable for these principles. For parents specifically, I'd like to, again, tap off of what Attorney Yoki said. You want to speak up You want to put your concern in writing to the right person. Be descriptive. Use dates where you can, people where you can, identify the actors. A lot of schools have cameras in the hallways. If you let the school know that something occurred, they're able to kind of go back and look at some of the footage and preserve that footage. So you want to make sure that you're preserving as much evidence as possible. Journals can be evidence, again, pictures and documents, et cetera. For our school communities, for our educators and our administrators, don't wait to meet the definition of harassment and bullying before you take action, right? If you wait for some particular incident that rises to that level, the child has already been harmed. You want to make sure that you're intervening right away, right away. We need to have environments in school where our young people feel comfortable. And it's not enough to wait until we've gotten to the point where the law's been violated. And so those are kind of some tips that I would share for people.
Absolutely, thank you. And just to kind of talk about that, I think something that we can do is instill confidence in each other to talk about whenever we're dealing with these instances. That we should talk about it, we should be having the confidence to step forward and say, hey, I'm dealing with a situation right now that needs to be addressed, and I'm seeking help. And so having that confidence to step up and to address an issue is something that I think we need to further instill in each other. And actually, while you were talking, some of my previous work experience kind of popped into my mind, where I used to work in child residential. And one of the things that we used to have to deal with was safety plans. And it was easy to help a child who was not following their own safety plan to get back in line. The issue that would occur is whenever the child was following their own safety plan, but staff and the people around them were not. The structure that they were depending on and told to follow when they were following it was not there. And so the question I have for both of you is that how do we reestablish trust for individuals who have dealt with harassment, who dealt with bullying, and follow what they're supposed to be doing, but got burnt by the system? How do we reestablish that trust? Attorney Joki, if you could go first.
Sure. So whenever I'm designing a safety plan, I like to designate a backup and a backup, just like my lists have lists. I want to make sure that that young person knows who to go to, and if that person isn't there, what to expect. And if another person isn't there, who to expect to be of support. Now, with recognition that things do not always go according to plan and that students' rights are violated, including by safety plans not being followed, it's really important for everybody to know what will happen if something doesn't go right. So it's important to know for students that I'm representing that they have a lawyer and they can let me know. I will never forget one of my students who was experiencing bullying and harassment at school, unfortunately including by staff. And she is a student who has emotional disabilities, and she was actually locked out of her school and told that she couldn't come in because her safety plan wasn't being followed. And she said to the school, you can call my attorney, I have one. And I actually did get a call. And I let them know that I need to go through their attorney, and the student ended up calling me and we had a good conversation. But knowing what will happen if something does not go according to plan is really important. And that's where the follow-through piece really matters. You do not have to wait until something is illegal to set the precedent that that is not allowable in the space and to try to holistically repair the harm that has happened. And that's why really employing restorative justice practices is really important. Having community activities is really important, in making schools places where students can go, want to go, and feel safe going. And that's whenever I talk with young people, that's the first thing I say. You know, I'm a lawyer, and it's my job to help make school a place you can go, want to go, and feel safe going. And so, you know, if something isn't going right, there are legal avenues that somebody could choose to explore. I recognize the law is not always the answer and can be an instrument of harm in and of itself, but that is available to folks if something goes sideways.
Thank you so much, Attorney Joki. DCC Williams, if you could you address the question I supposed?
Sure, sure. So I'd like to give you kind of a world example of what happens when these safety plans don't work or what can happen. There was a student that was being harassed and had been attacked in the cafeteria. Everything seems to happen on the playground, in the cafeteria, all the downtimes, right? Had been attacked. There were some things put in place. One, the student who attacked this particular student was to not be around that student, right? There was supposed to be some kind of physical separation. The other thing was the child that had been attacked would be able to go freely whenever they felt uncomfortable to the guidance counselor. And so it had been probably about a month since the child was attacked. They were in a classroom. They were in a classroom seated behind the person who had physically attacked them previously. So it's the first thing that went wrong, right? That student attempted to whip a computer cord at the child. Teacher saw it, addressed it by saying, "Stop, you can't do that," but didn't do anything to send that child down to the principal's office, didn't implement any of that kind of accelerated discipline for multiple attempts. Child asked to go to the guidance and instead was just sent to the lunchroom. The student that had previously attacked this child was held back from going to lunch to give the other student an opportunity to get there. And as soon as the child went into, again, that same lunchroom with this other child, they attacked that child again, another physical attack. If you can imagine, this child already had problems going to school after being attacked the first time. Had trusted the adults by, going to them and explaining what had happened. Had been told that they would be separated from the other child. That didn't happen. Had been told that they were safe at the school. Clearly that wasn't the case. And so, as you can imagine, there are long-term consequences for that child. And so that perhaps is an extreme example of what happens when school districts don't follow the appropriate plans. But these things happen. So it's really important not to break the trust of a child that is vulnerable, who comes forward and asks for assistance. It's really important to make sure that you follow through with what you can do. And in this particular situation, there were a couple of layers in that safety plan, right? There was first, keep the child away from the child that had been targeting that person. That didn't work. The next was let them go to the guidance counselor. That didn't work, right? And so as parents, we need to hold our districts accountable in these situations. We need to make sure before the child gets attacked that first level of protection that's put in, that's being followed through on. We need to make sure that all of the steps that are there and put into place for the student are followed through on before we get to the point where there could be these kind of dire consequences. And so it has, and it can have a really long-lasting effect. I can tell you the student won't walk home from school, and certainly the way that they have looked at school has been changed for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Morgan. And now we're going to have questions from the audience. And before we enter into this, I really want to encourage both people in audience and online to really ask questions. I firmly believe that iron sharpens iron, and that if we want to increase in our flourishing of the human experience, if we want to make our environment better, we should learn from each other. We have two experts here in this field, and so if you have questions, if you have any thoughts, now's really the time to bounce it off, because we don't want to leave this session with unanswered questions if possible. So if we have any questions from the audience, any questions from online, now's the time.
Mine's a two-part question. I want to know if statistical information is gathered from these reports of these individual schools in the state, and who gets that information, and if there's any oversight as far as the information that's gathered to show where the needs might arise or be in what specific schools and how that may be addressed.
I don't know the answer to that.
Attorney Joki, can you take that one?
Sure, yes, there is information that's collected. There is a hotline called Safe to Say in Pennsylvania where folks can also report, and that data is widely available. Schools are also required to report if certain crimes have happened on campus and exclusionary school discipline data, and some schools do have information around bullying and harassment, and sometimes that information can be disaggregated. So you can see how many complaints were filed on the basis of race, for example, or on the basis of disability. And sometimes schools do not publicize this information, right, because there's fear about blaming school staff or that families will feel unsafe sending their children to school. But that is why there are legal tools like requests for information and right to know requests that can be done. If you're curious about what's happening in a particular school, I would reach out to them specifically and ask for that information. I think that DCC Williams is absolutely right that sometimes incidences are treated as if they're a blip on a radar and not indicative of a toxic school climate that gave rise to that behavior. And so do follow up with your schools directly. And if you have questions about what information schools are required to share and where you can find that information, Education Law Center runs a free helpline, and that will be shared in the materials as well.
The Safe to Say program is really great. It's something that was started by the Attorney General's office, and students can make anonymous reports through that program. A police officer is assigned. They reach out to the school. They reach out to the alleged perpetrator, and you know, at some points, it's when things get to the point where law enforcement is involved, it's certainly an excellent tool.
Morgan, I just wanted to follow up a little bit with your experience with your daughter. If you could tell us a little bit more how you handled that situation, because as you said, it was your older daughter, so you would have had siblings maybe coming through that school, experiencing that same teacher. And I remember that from our family, looking into not wanting to have a certain teacher because of past experiences.
I certainly used it as an educational opportunity. You know, sometimes when you're close to a situation, maybe you don't handle things as well as, you know, the detached advice that we're able to give sometimes. But I did use it as an educational opportunity. I did make sure that my other children weren't in this particular teacher's class. I also struggled with what a lot of parents, I think, struggle with, which is a child that doesn't want to be the snitch. They don't want to report their teachers. They don't want to be labeled as a troublemaker, either by their peers or by the school, and that was no different for my daughter. It was something I think she struggled with at home a lot more than she did in the district. Luckily, the district honored my request, and none of my kids have had that teacher. But I don't know. Maybe I wish I would have been a little bit more aggressive with pursuing that for her, but it just wasn't something she wanted to do.
Hi, thank you for this panel. It's been really informative, and to all the panelists and moderator. My question actually in common is similar to what you were just talking about. How do we help educators and people in school deal with unconscious bias? Okay, so, and I think that there's definitely amazing educators out there. My mom is a retired teacher, so I know that most of them are out there to help the children for sure. But I can recall, I'll quickly mention this, when our daughter, so I'm sure a lot of you know about the unconscious bias where people will perceive Black children as older than they actually are just because of their own bias about those children. So our daughter was only 5 years old, and there was the issue with aftercare. She goes to aftercare after school or take the bus. She knew she was supposed to go to aftercare. She even told them, I knew she was supposed to. The teacher got confused. But most of the time, you would think, well, err on the side of caution, right? So you don't send a 5-year-old home on the bus alone. The more cautious thing to do, logically, would be to keep the child in aftercare, where there's other people. So our child was sent home, 5 years old, no one at the bus stop, no one at home. She's crying. Thankfully, we have really great neighbors. But I do think that that was, I do think that that had to do with unconscious bias, because I think that if there was a student who didn't happen to be Black, who there was a question of whether, oh, send this child home where the parents may not be home, or just keep them in aftercare, that would be done. So I'm just wondering how we can help educators with unconscious bias that they may not realize is even there. Right?
Certainly the commission offers training on unconscious bias, and there are a lot of other great providers who do. I can really relate to what you described about your child. I have a set of twins who, in 2nd grade, I did not let them walk home from school. We live in a walking community. And we had a teacher that decided it was time for them to walk home. And one day when we weren't as quick at picking them up as we could have been, they made that decision for our family to have that child, our twins, walk home. And so I think you have good points in terms of educators' bias and thinking kids are more capable or older than they could perhaps look. But I would encourage schools to get training on unconscious bias. That's something we all have to work on. Schools are no different. And it is something that the commission offers.
Is it all right if I jump in there too? So I just put a resource in chat, and I'm taking notes of the things I share in chat. So for folks in person, you'll have access to the same resources. But Education Law Center has a resource about how to build promising practices in our schools. And I couldn't agree more that addressing adultification bias is something that absolutely needs to happen. Our children deserve to work with teachers and administrators, and mental health professionals that share identities and lived experiences. You know, in Pennsylvania, 48% of our school districts employ not a single teacher of color, full stop. And that is an inexcusable reality. And so schools absolutely can and should adopt policies that are affirming, from training staff to training students to adopting equity policies, affirming dress and grooming codes so students can celebrate and bring their full selves to school and not face discrimination, including on the basis of hair texture or protective styles like the one I'm wearing. I'm wearing box braids. And I just, you know, there are so many opportunities for schools to build capacity and build networks of support and resources. Equity policies and equity audits are really important, because who knows better what's happening in the school than the folks that are there and the folks that are taking care of those that are there and the folks that are working there. And so what an equity audit does is it really looks at every single facet of a school. What do your policies say? What are your practices saying? How do those policies and practices impact educators, students, caregivers? And then changes are made accordingly. If a school isn't proactively considering anti-Black racism, ableism, sexism, transphobia, and homophobia, it's creating toxic environments for students, and there are resources available. The last resource I'll put in the chat is if you're working or have a young person who's in a school that you think could benefit from adopting different practices and trainings, school boards are there, and they're a place where you can make your input known. And we do have a resource as well on how to advocate to school boards, because I have seen firsthand the power that sharing stories has on creating better school environments. And while the onus should never be on young people to address the illegal and harmful conditions they're facing, they are powerful advocates, and we can champion and support them in creating the types of schools that they're demanding and they deserve.
I'm a previous high school counselor for 17 years, and this isn't really a question, but maybe just maybe a point, I don't know. Does the PHRC do anything to address, I guess one of the biggest problems I found with the bully was they were learning that someplace. They were learning that at home, they were learning that someplace, and they were bringing it to our school. And so you'd bring in these parents to address the issue with the bully, and then you'd just combat another bully. and it just was, that to me seemed to be the hardest part of it. Like, yes, helping my student deal with who was being affected by this and helping giving them resources, but addressing the situation where it's coming from and where it's coming from in homes, and so that's probably just a bigger that's a bigger issue altogether. But I don't know whether the PHRC does any sort of, I don't know, trainings or support things or things like that for the student who's coming from that environment at home. So that's my question.
Great question. I think, and I'm glad that we put the racial elephant in the room, because there is an intersection between race and disability. I'm going to say it again. There's an intersection between race and disability, and we have to acknowledge the racial elephants. Whether that's me being white from an urban, suburban, rural area, whether that's the intersection of race, socioeconomic against the backdrop if you juxtapose disability. And so I think it's also important for us to recognize that what is rooted in all of this is the need to have anti-racism training. Anti-racism training in schools. So when you talk about being a counselor, we think about the trauma that young people have to deal with. I'm disabled, I'm Jewish, I'm disabled, I'm LGBTQ+, I'm disabled. All of these emergent identities, all these identities, our young people are being discriminated against. And whether we want to have this conversation or not, they're being discriminated against, and they're faced with all of this xenophobia, and at times, it's by the very people we entrust to educate them. They're teachers. Their teachers are in several classes throughout the Commonwealth where they are being bullied, they're being othered. And so it's very important for us to look at that. I know we have some other people that might have some questions and some concerns. The other thing, questions and comments. The other thing, too, is there's program that we do at the Cheltenham High School in Philadelphia called COPE. Not the PHRC, but in some other work that I do called COPE. It's an acronym for Community Outreach Through Parent Empowerment, and it gets to exactly what you're saying. We have parents come, and we try to create a safe space, a safe environment for parents to talk about how they have racialized their children, how they have spoken to their children about who not to play in the sandbox with. To your point, Mrs. Holtz, the aspect of how white teachers and others see young black males older than they are. 6-year-old black male, Hispanic males taking a piece of paper, balling it up, putting it in a wastebasket, and the teacher is looking at him, not all, but looking at him through the guise of an unconscious bias, thinking that he's really 12 when he's only 6. Or if you have a young man who's 10. I was 10 and I was taller than all my teachers. And my teachers thought, and I see my good brother right here nodding in affirmation, my teacher thought I was actually 16, I was 10. And so those images, those racial imageries are those things that leads to the unconscious bias, depending on how we're having these conversations. You're absolutely right. You're going to go home and talk to the parents, and the parents are going to come in, and more often than not, the young person is learning that on all sides of the race, color line, all sides of the racial, gender line, however people describe themselves, in the home. In the home. The stereotypes that black parents are sharing about whites and others, and then you go to a place and then you're kind of fear of trepidation, thinking that you can't interact with that person, how whites view others. And so I think it's very important for us to have this conversation. One last thing is, you mentioned the SPIRIT program. Great. We have a civil rights division. We have a civil rights division that is in the community training in a different way than the SPIRIT program is doing. So please, as you follow us at PHRC, before the day concludes, our civil rights supervisor, if she can raise her hand, that's Cheryl Meck. If our CROC division can raise their hand, they're here in the house. These are the people that are doing anti-racism training, anti-bullying prevention and intervention. And I think it's very key for us to make sure that we don't lose sight of the intersection of race and disability, as well as all those other things, socioeconomic status, all of it intersects. And so I just wanted to add that part, because I was sitting here, phenomenal presentation, but I was just so relieved and I was able to exhale when I heard our colleague mention anti-black racism and all those other isms, because you can't have these conversations without having those variables in there.
Absolutely. We have time for one more question.
All right, I'd love to raise a question from the chat. There was some discussion about bullying and harassment and how it impacts adults as well, asking for some resources for workplace bullying as well as online as well.
Well, workplace bullying and harassment follows a similar kind of pattern that you would see in schools, and it's unlawful to discriminate against someone in the workplace by bullying or harassing them on the basis of one of our protected classes. And so we have what in the program? Some links. Okay. Our director of policy has just pointed out to me that we have some links in our program that are great resources for bullying and harassment. Imagine towards the back. Page 18. Great. So I'd encourage everyone to check them out, page 18.
So I just want to thank you, DCC Williams, and you too, Attorney Jokey, for the amazing content that you provided here. Can we give our presenters a hand, please? And I want to thank all of you in the audience for coming to this panel, because this is an utmost important topic. I'm glad we got to discuss it today. So I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. We'll be having lunch coming up, and please allow this to be a time that you get informed so that whenever you go back into the community, you can make each and every day better for your neighbor. Thank you, and I hope you all have a great day.